Hello, welcome. It's Digital Foundry Direct Weekly. It is the 180th edition. And what can I say? We've got a packed show for you today. Now, obviously, previously we have put out a DF Direct special on the PlayStation 5 Pro reveal. There have been developments. We have got much more to say about that presentation now. And joining me to talk about it, first of all, Oliver Mackenzie. Hello.
Yes, very exciting to actually see with crystal clear ProRes vision these games, finally.
Yes.
Absolutely. And Alex Battaglia, hello.
Yeah, that's kind of cool. It's been a while since we've been provided a ProRes file for games, journalism aspects. But yeah, I'm excited to talk about some PSSR.
Yes, but let's just quickly talk about why things are different. Now, obviously, we produced our first Direct special in the wake of the PS5 Pro reveal based on its YouTube presentation. And as we discussed at length, in that particular special, it was actually difficult to see what was going on, primarily because, it was YouTube compression, and that doesn't work nicely with intricately detailed visuals at 4K resolution, which is kind of the whole point of PlayStation 5 Pro, seemingly. But we have got this ProRes asset. Now, ProRes is essentially the compression, the codec that's used primarily by the broadcast industry. And it's an intermediate codec of extremely good quality compared to what you generally tend to see. And it basically means that we can actually see the presentation, we can see the games, kind of like the way that they're actually going to present on the screen. So this is kind of like a big deal. It also means that we've got assets to show you that we can work with far more easily than we did with the reveal footage, which was incredibly compromised. Now, you might be asking the question, well, we're watching this on YouTube. What difference does it make? You're going to have exactly the same problems that Sony did. And, well, let's just say that we've been doing this for a long time now, doing things like zooms, slowing down footage. There's a lot of techniques you could use to actually preserve detail within the medium that we've got. So that's what we're going to do. And this has basically opened the door to us to deliver actual numbers and metrics and figures based on the footage that was out there, which we couldn't do previously. So you can't really consider this a do-over, but it's a more considered, nuanced take on the stuff that was actually out there earlier this week. This time, though, we can actually see what's going on. So with that, let's move on to our first news topic. Well, I guess it's not so much a news topic. Basically, we're going to be going through the games individually where we think we've got things to say about them. Mark Cerny kicked off the presentation with The Last of Us Part 2, which was a bit of a contentious choice because ultimately it started out live on PlayStation 4, right? But PlayStation 5 version has much to praise, and now we've got a PS5 Pro version. Who took a look at this? Oliver, do you want to take point on this one?
Yes, I love TLOU and TLOUp Part 2. And I think this is a very interesting first showing because it is a very effective PSSR upgrade. Like, subjectively speaking, both sides of the image, which are the PS5 Fidelity mode, which is at native 4K, and the PS5 Pro version with no particular mode specified, they look very similar. Now, there are some differences. To me, the most significant difference is that the grass in the PS5 PSSR view tends to ghost a bit, to basically blend together a little bit in motion, whereas the native 4K view on PS5 presents clean, sharp grass in every frame, which is like a typical trouble area for reconstruction solutions, often a sore spot for FSR2, which has a particularly nasty resolve in those elements. But here it's not so bad. I think it might be a common feature of PSSR based on some other games. But yeah, and there's some other minor problems, like the roots above Elianacine do shimmer just a tiny bit as the player moves forward. There might be a little bit of subpixel issues there. But TLOU Part 2 doesn't have the best TAA either, so when you compare it to TLOU Part 2, it actually doesn't come across too bad. It actually looks pretty good. And of course, these are all just like super nitpicky critiques. If you're actually playing the game, especially with motion blur, you're not going to notice these problems probably in all likelihood when actually playing the game in most situations, I would suspect. But I think the interesting thing for me here, and potentially the part that's going to be a little bit controversial, but I think is totally explainable and totally fine, is that in terms of raw numbers, we're looking at 1440p here at 60 FPS. I counted 4 or 5 frames. They all counted it at 1440p, which is actually the same resolution as the PS5 in its performance mode. And the nice thing here is that PSSR is pretty easy for us to pixel count at the moment, so it's actually not too hard to find those numbers. But critically, because the PS5 in its performance mode is using a bilinear or maybe bicubic upscale from 1440p to 4K, it's not giving you any extra detail, whereas the PS5 Pro is upsampling that 1440p to 4K, kind of like DLSS's quality mode. It's doing a very good job of that. It looks very similar to a native 4K render, like you can see in the side-by-sides here. So I think it's a very effective and probably fairly typical kind of upgrade that I think we will see a fair bit of on PS5 Pro. And it is a very good upgrade for sure.
Interesting. So, Alex, let's have some conjecture here. The same resolution, but it's not really, because that's not really the way reconstruction techniques work, right? You're not dealing with a singular base resolution. There's a lot more to it, right?
Yeah, well, so there's the things you have to consider here too. PSSR is going to have its own cost in frame time to essentially get the image up to 4K. And usually that cost is just a function of the output resolution. For DLSS, for example, it's just the matter of, even if it's 1080p or 720p internal, the cost of upscaling to 4K, the upscaling time will be the same. And I think we read from internal documentation that'll be around 2 milliseconds or so, at least for the initial release of PSSR, which is, that's a sizable amount of a 16.6 millisecond frame time budget for a game targeting 60 FPS. So you've got that. It takes up its own amount of time to get up there. So if you're paying attention and want to get 60 FPS, you have to budget still. And another budgeting aspect about post-process upscaling via image reconstruction is that it's technically, at least as the way DLSS is supposed to be done, the post-processing effects, such as motion blur, potentially bloom, potentially depth of field, a lot of them should technically be run after DLSS at the native output resolution at that point. So you would have things like depth of field running at 4K. And as we know, depth of field, like when you get right close to a character and it blooms out and you get those really big bokeh shapes, that's when it gets really, really expensive usually. So if they have to contend with the cost potentially of 4K post-processing, on top of the fact that it costs 2 milliseconds already, and the fact that the GPU is only 45% better, according to Mark Cerny saying it in a video, for things that are like typical rasterization, well, then it makes sense actually, I think, if they want to keep a consistent 60 FPS, to keep the internal resolution very similar, if not just maybe a tiny bit higher, and then just let PSSR make the quality much higher. And I think that's the way I would also do it on PC too. If I were a PC player, I wouldn't necessarily just run everything at flat 4K just because I can. So there's that. There's also the fact that we're dealing with a power constrained console. We haven't had too much evidence of it yet, but technically there is a balance there between overloading the GPU and the CPU on the PS5 that the Xbox Series X doesn't have, for example. And if they want to keep the frame rate high at 60 at all times, it makes sense to not just run everything flat out. They want to, I would say, reserve power for the parts when they might need them at different points in the storyline. So I feel like there's a couple of conjecture reasons here we can throw out as to why it's still 1440p internally. But I think at the end of the day, the most important thing is the image quality. And generally, it's close enough and better in some aspects to the native 4K presentation from Fidelity Mode, which is kind of why machine learning based reconstruction is great, right? So
yeah, it's kind of like the whole point of the exercise really is that, the emergence of DLSS on PC has basically meant the concept of what your base internal resolution is versus what actually hits your eyeballs is quite different at this point. And this is the first proper console implementation of a machine learning based reconstruction formula. And as first impressions go, I think it looks pretty good here. But it also highlights the fact that going forward, console designs aren't just going to be throwing a huge amount of extra transistors at the size of the GPU because they just can't do that. The economics don't work. And, we're already seeing the economics pushed to the limits with PlayStation 5 Pro. You know, if you can imagine how much this system would have cost if they didn't have PSSR and instead they were going for like, you know, whatever, 96 compute units or whatever's required to actually, you know, double and then some the performance of a base PlayStation 5. It's a fool's errand. So, you know, it's all about basically producing an efficient design. And yeah, we're going to be critiquing PSSR compared to DLSS and other upscaling solutions. But ultimately, I think the other thing to bear in mind is that as of yet, very few people are actually connecting their PCs to living room displays. It's typically displays that are right in front of you. So, you know, the actual effect of the presentation at range is also going to be quite different. But yeah, this is an interesting thing, and it's an interesting example of basically like for like native versus reconstructed. And it's not bad. I think it's pretty good. Do we have anything more to say about The Last of Us Part 2? It's I don't know. If you think about prior Naughty Dog patches, I mean, I don't think this has been like a core focus of development for them. It's obviously a bolt-on extra. So when we actually come to proper first-party titles that are developed with both SKUs in mind, then we'll probably see something quite different. But this is certainly just an interesting, is it, what did you call it, Oliver? Prototypical.
I think it is prototypical.
Prototypical use of PSSR.
I'd also say that it also is the case this game is likely not using dynamic resolution based on the fact that no Naughty Dog titles have used dynamic resolution. So maybe there is a little bit more juice left to squeeze, and we're just not seeing it quite here.
Okay, good stuff. Well, let's move on to the next game that caught our eye. Alex, Ratchet and Clank. You spent a lot of time with this game on the PC version because it's kind of been what you might call a test bed for comparing pretty much every single reconstruction-based upscaling algorithm out there. And lo and behold, we now have PSSR added to the mix. And we've got some clean footage now of Ratchet. I mean, earlier in the week when you didn't, you were struggling to come up with something that would broadly comparable.
I'll talk about that in a second.
But it looks like you've got a lot of notes here based on the docket about Ratchet. So, you know, let rip.
Yeah, so just want to say with regards to Ratchet and a later title, Horizon Forbidden West, that for some reason, at least in the core presentation from Cerny, none of the B-roll provided, there is some sort of post-processing being done to the footage that like really crushes the blacks in it and moves the white midpoint down. So whites tend to look grayer as a result of that too. And all the shadows lose a lot of their internal detail. They come like pure black almost. That is a thing. It could either be a capture error or something they applied to the footage, maybe by accident. I have no idea. But that affects some of the things we're going to be talking about here. So when I show images of Ratchet, I have tweaked the PC version's images to be more similar to the PlayStation 5 Pro footage we have. But technically, I think if you were playing the game, it would look quite different. And if you see any differences, that's just because I'm trying to approximate the look of the footage, not because there's actually a difference in color there. Okay, so let me get that out of the way. That's good. Ratchet and Clank. Now, I think this is really interesting because we just had now TLOUp where it's kind of taking that performance mode and adding PSSR to it. Well, and with a flat base resolution, most likely. That is not at all the way Insomniac have rolled their games in the past. They've extensively used dynamic resolution scaling for a long time. And they apply their IGTI on top of that to get that up to either 1440p or 4K, depending upon the game and mode you're selecting. Here, for Ratchet and Clank, I did note it was really countable. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is maybe because PSSR in general is more countable than something like DLSS or some checkerboard rendering techniques. Or it's also because Ratchet and Clank, at least based upon some of the things you can set on PC, as well as I would say the general look of the output, is maybe over sharpened. And that is causing some of the aliasing to stick out a lot more because sharpening is increasing local contrast, which then makes edges more obvious, including edges that don't have good anti-aliasing. So that is a thing to consider. As a result of that, though, it was really countable even in still images, which is usually reconstruction's best. Like if the image is sitting still, sometimes it can just look straight 4K. And even in just like still images, I could count anywhere between 1440p, like when the action's going up, or up to almost 1800p when nothing was happening and it was like looking towards the sky briefly. So it's like this range, and that is roughly, I think, the range of like the quality mode in Ratchet and Clank, you know, if I recall, on the PlayStation 5. So it seems like it's taking that almost, but there's a big difference in the settings that we see here, because this kind of points at another aspect that was in that PlayStation 5 Pro presentation from Cerny, that the power isn't there just to bring up a fidelity mode to 60 FPS for a variety of reasons. GPU, CPU, memory bandwidth, it's all not necessarily there. So what they've done here is it looks like they're taking the settings from the performance mode of Ratchet and Clank, which, you know, has reduced settings for a variety of areas, and then using PSSR to bring that up to 4K. And that's kind of what we're getting here. So if you put it next to like the Ultra PC version in these shots that I have here, you'll see that like there's reduced crowd density. The LOD in the distance is lower. You know, there's like more geometric edges you can see there. There's no background depth of field. That's something that the PlayStation 5 version, its performance mode cut out, that was interestingly not able to be toggled on PC as an option. So there are some other things there too, as well as the fact that post-processing, and I don't think this is also an option on PC, is quarter resolution. And you can see that sometimes when like an effect pops on screen really quickly and it's all of a sudden the game looks really jagged, even though the rest of the scene doesn't look that way. Oliver noted it when like he's coming out of the portal, and I noted it as one time, like right as he uses that lasso tether to get into a portal, everything looked 720p all of a sudden. I was like, what? And it's like, no, that's quarter res of the real internal resolution at that moment, which is 1440p. Okay, so there's that. So it's not the like ultra settings, it's not the fidelity mode settings, it's the you know, performance mode PS5 settings brought up to 4K using PSSR. And in this title, it's a little bit more easy to count due to a lot of factors. But what does it look like versus what we can compare to on PC? Well, in this shot here, I counted the PS5 Pro, the one where he's waving at the crowds. It's actually like 728p, and I can tell that just by like shadows moving would cause edges to be brighter. And that would show the internal alias, which is weird. You wouldn't usually get that. But like I said, I think this title's over sharpened. And here I can't get 1728p internal resolution on PC very easily. So I just compared it to the quality modes and the performance modes of at least some of the upscalers. So for FSR, the first thing I want to talk about is that it's way better than FSR in a lot of ways.
You'd hope so.
So you'd hope so. And that's the whole point of PSSR. And that's what we want. So for example, like if you look at the crowds in the stands, they are like every single time they like clap and move, there's like this massive like garble behind them and on their arms as they move and get up and down. That's from the FSR view, but in PSSR they are much cleaner. They're a bit over sharpened looking, but they don't have that bad movement look which characterizes FSR. And it's the reason why when we talked about FSR 2 originally, it's like, oh, in stills it's fine enough, but as soon as the image starts moving, that's when it gets really bad. And yeah, if you look also at the shot of Ratchet here in the front, like as his hand moves up and down, there's none of that like that breakup and that fizzle along the edges of his hands or on his face as the hand gets in the way. It's all way better in PSSR. But if you look at the distance, in the first part of the video I sent you here, Oliver, if you look at this tree in the background, one thing that I noticed with PSSR is this like finer sub-pixel detail of the little leaves on the tree. It is like constantly shimmering. And if you look over the image, it's actually got a lot of that in this game. FSR 2 does that interestingly better here in its quality mode. And if we go over to DLSS in quality mode, you'll see an even finer difference there. That tree is like very stable looking in DLSS, whereas it's, you know, shimmering with PSSR at a higher resolution internally. And, you know, the rest of the movement stuff all looks, I would say, finer actually in DLSS quality mode. But given that this is the first outing that we've seen of PSSR, I don't expect it to be beating DLSS, kind of like with XeSS, where it's going to take time for the model to improve. And this is, you know, this is just something that you have to deal with. But yeah, so first impressions are, I also compared it to DLSS performance mode, just for giggles here. And there you can notice that DLSS performance mode does like stabilize that tree in the distance, subpixel detail there, more than PSSR. But if you look at the edges of opaque objects, DLSS in performance mode has like a cross-hatching effect going up like vertical and downward. And that's something that doesn't appear there on PSSR. So, it's actually a lot higher base resolution here, but you can say that it can provide technically a better experience than lower performance mode of DLSS, which is something that wasn't necessarily guaranteed for FSR. So I think it just shows, as my first impressions of PSSR from this really high quality footage, is that it is better than FSR2 in a lot of ways. The core ways that made FSR2 not good, it's better. So I think that's awesome, to say the least.
Okay. Oliver, did you take a look at this one as well?
I did, but I compared it mostly to the PlayStation 5 in its fidelity mode, which I think is actually, it's actually a little closer. I just looked up. It's a little closer to like 4K, usually like 1800p to 4K. I imagine that probably the PlayStation 5 Pro here is running close to the fidelity mode at 40 FPS. I'd guess that it's probably a similar resolution range to that.
Right.
So yeah, I think it looks pretty good here, but I'd say it's slightly less positive than a title like TLOUp, because some of the results are visibly less clean than what we're getting out of the fidelity mode. Edge artifacts are more pronounced. You see some aliasing, like Alex mentioned, in that final image, where weirdly the image is at rest or close to at rest. There's not much movement. Usually DLSS would clean this up, but there is some aliasing visible in that final image, and it does look a touch over sharpened in some shots for sure. It's definitely a lot better than the performance mode, and it resolves a lot more detail in that mode. I think the results in TLOU at the moment are a little bit more natural looking and a little bit closer to that ideal native 4K view, even though the internal resolution in TLOU is actually often a little bit lower. So that's interesting. And yeah, one thing you will notice is that the crowds in the PS5 fidelity mode, like on PC with higher end settings, it is a more dense crowd. And on PS5 in the performance mode, it is not as dense. And that also seems to be true in the PlayStation 5 Pro version, and presumably its performance mode. Now, we don't know what the mode settings will be, unfortunately, on PlayStation 5 Pro, but presumably there is, one or two more modes at least that do expand out that visual presentation in exchange for a lower frame rate. So yeah, I think it's positive, but among the games we're looking at today, it probably has the most room to improve in terms of image quality, I suspect. I'm not quite sure why. Even a title like Spider-Man, which is from the same developer, is a little bit cleaner than this, I think. So there is some room to improve. It is a good effort, and it does look a lot better. And for sure, I'd rather play this on the PS5 Pro for sure than on PS5 in its performance RT mode, which this mode comes close to. But at the moment, yeah, there is a little bit of weirdness in the image that I'd like to see cleaned up.
Interesting. Yeah, I think you're quite right in that, Insomniac are the masters of multiple modes, and I think we're just looking at one of them here, presumably the performance mode. I mean, there's a lot to look forward to elsewhere, obviously. What are the equivalents for the 30 and 40 FPS modes, assuming they are there? I suspect they are. What about the VRR stuff that's going to be happening there? I mean, all of this Sony first-party titles have got a pretty comprehensive range of VRR options. So we're just looking at a snapshot of a bit of Ratchet and Clank here. So I'm going to be interested to see where they actually push this in other directions as well. But let's move on. Okay, so this one's quite interesting because we really wanted to see what PlayStation 5 Pro would do with Alan Wake 2 in the wake of, so to speak, in the wake of the PC version, which is very, very scalable. Certainly in the upwards direction. However, in the presentation, we had 6 or 7 seconds of footage. That is 420 frames.
Yeah, wow.
Let's talk about this, Alex. I mean, what were we seeing here?
Yeah.
What were the performance targets, first of all? Because obviously the PlayStation 5 version has a 30 and 60 FPS mode. So what were we looking at in our 400 odd frames?
Well, here I think we're seeing the two modes.
What, within the space of 6 seconds?
Or maybe that we don't know,
Okay.
but I presume they're two modes based upon the fact that the one footage was really obviously running at 60. That's Alan in the tunnels of New York as like a flare goes off. And then the footage of Saga fighting, I don't remember. It's like one of the, images from Alan's, waking imagination in like a water area. That one was really obviously 30 FPS. And there was differences in you just look at them. One looked higher res than the other. And I thought this was also really easy to count. So that's kind of like a thing, like a PSSR thing at the moment. Like we're not having big trouble counting this, even though like Alan Wake is that's good for us. But like, Alan Wake is like a really dark game. And I could count even that, like that Saga shot, like where she moves, and I could count like the side of like her Glock, or like the side of her jacket too, with like Alan Wake, typical, like the scene with Alan Wake where he's in the sewers. A thing that reconstruction techniques don't tend to do very well is like something that's perfectly emissive. Typically the edges on that show the internal resolution in games, and that was perfectly countable. It was like just a straight internal resolution line. So there I got around 864p internally at that moment in Alan Wake 2 in the 60 FPS section. And it was like 1260-ish or so in the Saga section. That line was a little bit not as long, so you couldn't get it such a precise value. But so it looks like some two different modes, one as a much higher internal resolution than the other. That's interesting. It's also somewhat similar to what we saw with the base Alan Wake 2 on PlayStation 5.
Right. Which was using FSR2 in both cases.
Which is using FSR2. I presume this is not using FSR2. It's really dark footage, so it's kind of hard to tell, but I presume it's using PSSR just because why show it off otherwise?
Yeah. Well, the other thing, of course, is that FSR2 was probably the most impactful thing to image quality in the base PlayStation 5 game. It wasn't great, was it?
No, it wasn't. A lot of reasons for that. The lens barrel distortion, the serious amount of foliage in the game, the rapid change from light to dark constantly, something that also FSR doesn't like a lot. But one thing to note about the 30 FPS footage is that I don't know what they could port over to PlayStation 5 Pro. The options on PC for ray tracing are very expensive because they're uncompromising, is the way I would describe them. Like a lot of games would be like, oh, it's quarter resolution. Oh, we don't reflect all the objects. Like these are typical optimization compromises that people use for games, and especially console games with RT. But the ones on PC were not like that at all. They was just like reflect everything, reflect all levels of roughness. It was very intense. So, but as I say that, when Saga pans her gun over the background detail there while aiming at this creature, there aren't any SSR artifacts. Right. So
is that
could mean something. That could mean nothing.
That's the 60 FPS clip, though, right?
No, that's the 30 FPS
right,
clip.
Okay.
The 60 FPS clip has actually obvious SSR in it because the way it looks, first of all, but also it bends with the screen space information there. Like when the frame buffer is distorted, it bends the SSR with it, and it's like that's not the way reflections work. So you can tell that something isn't right there. But the Saga footage could potentially have some level of ray traced reflections, based upon my experience with the PC version, where usually Saga's arm getting in the way of something reflective on the floor would make a huge line in it. So I don't know, but I think it's cool because we've only talked about first party stuff so far, and third party is where maybe PlayStation 5 Pro is more interesting.
Yes, absolutely. Because
it'll clean up image quality there and will potentially allow for effects that were seen in PC versions of the games. So I'm excited about that. More so than TLOUp running at a higher res, actually.
Okay, yeah. Oliver,
sorry.
Oliver, 6 to 7 seconds of footage. Any notes?
Oh man, it's so brief. I completely agree with Alex there. I think that Alan Wake 2 has a little bit of a messy SSR resolve, and kind of doesn't look too great sometimes on console. So for sure, when you look at that 30 FPS footage, I was thinking the same thing with the way that Saga's gun is getting in the way. For sure that would cause some issues with the SSR there, and you would see some huge breakup, and there isn't like a really accurate cube map reflection usually in Alan Wake 2 to fall back on to preserve that reflective detail. So I'd certainly think that's the case. I do think I did take a look at Alan Wake 2 on console back in the day, and I think that title's image quality was probably its worst aspect. Obviously, you'd like to see more ray tracing featured in that title, but for sure the FSR2 resolve was pretty rough. In the quality mode, it was pretty okay at a normal viewing distance, but for sure in that performance mode, you're looking at like 874p resolution up to 1440p. It was just super rough, especially on like a lot of the fine details in that game. A lot of the foliage, just super messy. So for sure, I think expecting like the full path trace experience for Alan Wake 2 is probably a little bit too much for PlayStation 5 Pro based off of the more moderate ray tracing upgrades that we are seeing in that console's hardware spec. But it is good to see some improvements, possibly the addition of one ray tracing effect at least, and probably a much nicer version of Alan Wake 2 to actually look at in motion.
Okay, so to sort of summarize here, we're thinking 30 FPS mode gets a ray tracing upgrade, possibly. Performance mode probably gets a quality upgrade in some respect, because the resolutions are very, very similar to the base PlayStation 5. So,
very similar,
essentially, they're diverting GPU horsepower to more effects, and then or quality of pixels, if you like, and then using PSSR to overall improve image quality. So that's a really interesting choice from a third party, assuming our analysis of 6 to 7 seconds.
One thing to think about as well is that in that quality mode, because they're already doing FSR 2 to 4K, putting PSSR in there should not really be too much of an ask, presuming they are trying to hit that same 4K resolution. Whereas in the performance mode, if they're doing the same thing that a lot of other developers are doing and exploiting it to really push that performance mode up to 4K resolution, maybe they're not going to have as much GPU time left over for other things, because they
That's
are
interesting.
Right.
Yeah, they are taking
or CPU time.
That GPU cost is basically eaten up by that enormous 4K upsample from a much lower base resolution, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, this is a title when it does come out. I'm gonna be very interested in comparing it to PC, because if I recall, the performance mode also had like the lower quality shadows, which was another kind of like sticking point. There was also the fact that there was an option on PC that allowed you to change like perhaps where in the pipeline post-processing was done. So you could get like low-res post-processing with upscaling or high-res post-processing with upscaling. There was an option for that on PC, and I'm curious to see where for example, this more 4K looking, the 30 FPS version that we're seeing here, I'm curious to see where it lies in those settings, because like we saw with Ratchet and Clank, it looked like the post-processing there was still like low resolution. So I'm curious to see whether or not Sony mandates, almost like DLSS is mandated, even though not everyone follows it, to use high-res post-processing. I'm just curious. Okay. I have no idea.
Well, based on the quality, on the performance here that inflicted on the PC version, I'd suspect it's not a great fit for any console.
No, it's so expensive to turn that up. It's like huge. Yeah.
Okay. Let's move on. Next game we really want to talk about is Horizon Forbidden West, and there seems to be a lot going on here. And what can I say? I'm going to leave it to Alex to talk about it.
Oh, I got something here. Well, Oliver also looked at it too. So I'll compare and talk about the one thing I looked at. I just loaded up the game's intro on PC. And that one scene, I don't know the name of the character. I'm sorry. The guy with the beard who talks to Aloy in the beginning of the game. They show a brief snippet, which is from that initial cutscene. And so I put it side to side with the game running on a 4070 here, using DLA DRS, and the game maxed out. And there was two things that I wanted to know. One is I can't get the footage to look exactly the same due to the color problem that I talked about earlier. Their capture looks wrong. But the resolution didn't look like 4K. Like really clean, pixel perfect lines. It's like softer. And so that's one thing to talk about the image quality here. softer. And for some reason in this cutscene, the shadows are different, including the volumetrics in the background, which are affected by shadows. I'm not sure why. Oliver loaded up the PlayStation 5 version, and you saw something similar, right?
Yeah, so I have some speculations on it, basically, in part because initially I was trying to find pixel edges. And now after my 1 day of pixel counting PSSR, I feel like I have a decent handle on it. So I'd been counting PSSR for a couple hours, and I went on to Horizon, and I was having a very hard time trying to find those pixel edges. And I think because of the way that Mark Cerny in particular frames this title, and because of the image resolve, which is a little bit smoother, like Alex said, it is very smooth, but it's also absent of some image artifacts that we often see with other kinds of upsampling solutions or just TAA in general. I think it's probably not using PSSR. And if you compare PS5 and Pro here in the one shot that I did manage to scrounge together with the PS5 in its performance mode, which is an 1800p checkerboard resolution, the detail is definitely higher on PS5 Pro. It's resolving more detail in the hair in his shirt, more of the skin texture. It's got cleaner edge detail. The scene lighting is also a little bit different. Like Alex said, there's that difference in the shadows, which is a little bit weird, but it is a cinematic shot, so it's hard to be super certain about that one. Personally, I think it's probably, if I had to guess, a 4K checkerboard, which would comport with the PS5 version and its 4K checkerboarded balanced mode. That's my suspicion. I can't say for certain, obviously. We'll need to see the final game. We'll need to examine those edges a little bit more. But I think based off of the way that it's resolving and based on the way that checkerboarding often struggles to resolve like super fine detail in the image, especially in the Horizon titles, I think that could be the case.
Right.
They're also talking about improved visual effects, lighting, and improved skin, and improved hair. For visual effects, I mean, this is kind of just a big question mark. I mean, I know they have that cloud sim that they're very proud of. They could always boost resolution there. I don't know. But lighting is kind of a mystery to me. I don't think it's RTGI or anything like that. Improved skin, improved hair. I mean, you can always improve skin shaders. Their hair looks quite nice. I'm sure maybe they could improve that further. But I'd expect the primary improvement here, personally, just judging from these images, to probably come from that increase in actual perceived detail because of, presumably, an improvement to the resolution of the game.
Yeah. Like, another thing to not forget is that Horizon is also like dynamic res CBR. Weirdly enough, like it can technically go below 1800 CBR on the PS5 base. And if that was stabilized to like a near flat 2160p CBR, checkerboard rendering, that would look like a lot cleaner game depending upon which scene you're in, right? Obviously darker scenes you wouldn't notice so much, but like anything with like a lot of grass, foliage, etc., you'd probably notice. So I would like... This footage is like, once again, a very tiny snippet, but both this and TLOUP2 I feel like are just like somewhat not so interesting so far. I'm really more interested in the people that use that power for transformative differences. Like I do like if a game would change the way ray tracing is done, or
right. I get what you're saying.
Like
yeah, I think we've got to keep in mind that all of these developers are working on other projects, and these would have been retrofit patches for the PS5 Pro. And if you think about if you think about the complexity, the amount of effort that went into devising and then refining Horizon Forbidden West's performance mode to actually rip all of that work out and then put in PSSR on the off chance that it's better, it probably wasn't worth the developmental effort. So this might actually be interesting in a different way, Alex, in that it's actually about using the extra performance for features and an image quality bump. But maybe we'll see something different from them next time around with their next actual first-party title. But yeah, interesting stuff. We're going to move on again. Okay, so third parties didn't get a huge amount of representation in the PlayStation 5 Pro reveal, and it was with some measure of surprise that we actually saw a clip of Hogwarts Legacy specifically to highlight improvements to ray tracing. And Oliver, do you have some notes about this?
I do. So they sort of imply, they say ray tracing, and then they say to improve the reflections and the shadows. So I presume we're getting RT reflections and RT shadows.
Yeah.
For me personally, there is one shot that I managed to match pretty much perfectly on PlayStation 5 in its Fidelity RT mode, which also features RT reflections.
Yeah.
And here, very interesting, it looks very similar. And actually, you do see some breakup on both versions in especially like the smaller bits of cutlery. You tend to notice those really fine, very curved bits of cutlery. They do tend to exhibit a lot of RT like noise to them, speckling to them. Now, UE4's RT is maybe not the most refined, but that is an issue here. And it's actually, interestingly, a little bit more prominent in the PS5 Pro version of that title in that footage. It could be because the resolution of the underlying rendering may be lower, or it could be for another reason. And if we get up close to those reflective surfaces on the PS5 code, we also do see a lot of breakup in them. So it seems to be a similar kind of issue. But I think Alex might also have some thoughts on how the title is resolving its RT reflections.
Yeah. So one thing, if they did adjust the roughness cutoff, which is one thing I'm pretty sure the options in the PC version for RT reflections in this game actually did adjust, was the amount of objects that could potentially get it based upon how rough they are. If that has been adjusted, that could potentially increase noise in the image, because if you do look at the side by side, you'll see that more of like the upper part of this, what is this, a mess hall, a dining hall? I was about to say call it a chapel because it looks like one, but you can see the stained glass windows more in the reflection, essentially. And there's could be a variety of reasons for that. One, really, there is actually an option in UE4 to make it so that the rougher the surfaces it is, the shorter the ray that is bounced off it becomes, to make it so that less of those reflections show up, because they are harder to denoise, they're more expensive to trace, and they're more expensive to shade and all these other things. There is an option for that in UE4's version of RT reflections. And if they maybe changed that value, that's why you could see potentially more things at a distance that could be traced against. There's that, also the RT reflection thing, like if their roughness is different, it could lead to more noise. That's really about it, but it almost does look like it's like lower resolution in some way, in some weird way.
In terms of the reflection.
This is a title that, it just looks weirdly like more shimmery in a way that it isn't on the side with PlayStation 5. Really good lineup there, by the way, Oliver.
Yeah.
That must have been hard.
wasn't too bad. There's also RT shadows here, but I did note in the footage, and again, maybe I can get some Alex commentary on this because he really knows a lot about Unreal. But the RT shadows do look slightly strange to me, like around the base of the stool in the shot that shows off the RT shadows. They appear very sharp and slightly misaligned around just the base of that stool detail. And I'm not sure if that's some kind of quirk in how the RT shadows work, where they might have a defocused RT shadow and then a very sharp close one, sort of like how the Callisto protocol worked, which was also a UE4 title. Right. Or maybe I've also seen similar things in games where maybe a screen space shadow is being used to try to fill in some shadow detail, and that might be messing things up a bit. I'm not quite sure, but it does look a little bit weird and a little bit strange. I'm not sure if that's reflective of the entire game shadow implementation, but it doesn't quite look right. But the shadows do, to be fair, they do look very clean and they do look quite good there. They aren't exhibiting any of the kind of aliasing that I did see in the shadow presentation on PlayStation 5. So that is definitely an improvement in all likelihood for the PlayStation 5 Pro code.
Yeah, for me, looking at the stool, it looks 100% like screen space shadows are they're actually messing up the shadow. They would look better without screen space shadows. That's actually something that can happen in games. Another thing to note, the background distant when he's flying on what I presume is a hippogriff. I don't have any good knowledge of these Harry Potter movies. Or is it some sort of stallion? What is it? I don't know what this is.
I haven't been exposed to the plot in some time.
I don't know what this is. Either way, you can see that the reflections on the ground actually that are in the water don't make too much sense if you look at the background geometry there. Doing really far away reflections in UE4 is probably a CPU nightmare. So I haven't spent too much time with this game, but I'm also very curious to see this when this comes out, because I kind of thought it was a very messy release and performance. Very messy performance. But like the footage we're seeing here, it's primarily 30 FPS, right? So is there going to be different modes that offer 60?
Well, the base PlayStation 5
what's
version is a 60 FPS mode, so the idea that the Pro one won't is a non-starter. It's going to have modes.
Yeah. Also, on the PlayStation 5 code in the Fidelity RT mode, perhaps for the reason that you mentioned, they actually did not ray trace reflections out into larger bodies of water. It was mostly just like puddles and the interiors of, glossy rooms, glossy floors, things like that. So yeah, if they are doing ray tracing on these larger bodies of water, that might be a big improvement. But like you said, that it does look a little bit misaligned there, which is not ideal.
Yeah, I mean, there's only so much you could do in UE4, honestly. It's a kind of bad RT engine, actually.
Okay, fair enough. Let's move on. Gran Turismo 7. Obviously, Polyphony Digital have always pushed the limits of technology on PlayStation consoles, and it looks like they're doing it again. We've got an upgrade here to the base game. It's looking impressive. We're getting RT reflections on track, as they like to say. There's also there's also discussions of an 8K mode, which we discussed in the first direct. Kind of nuts, but I'm happy it exists. Now we've got better footage. And who wants to talk about that?
I kind of don't mind. I talked with John a lot about this because John is our GT expert here, and he downloaded the footage. And I wanted to say two things mainly. The first thing is John's initial impression was, this looks lower res. And I thought that was a very interesting John reaction to that. John knows this game obviously like the back of his hand. He literally spent so many hours in it due to that Forza Motorsport versus GT7
fair
video.
Point.
He spent like so much time in there. But he said it looked noticeably lower res to him. And I think there's two good reasons for that. The first is because it is lower res. So it's countable like a lot of PSSR games, but I was really interested on like the opaque edges that don't have ray traced reflections in them. To get clean edges for that, I waited for the camera cuts to occur in all the footage that we have that is of replays, right? I think there's replay footage here. And every camera cut there was around like 1188p, which is like 60% of axis resolution 4K, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe even a little bit higher or lower. But that is interesting because the base game without RT reflections on PlayStation 5, I think is a native 4K going up to 60. And that is a huge drop in resolution. Really huge, but they're using PSSR most likely to bring it up to a 4K looking presentation. But another aspect which makes this look lower res, and to John's eye just looked lower res to him, was the fact that the RT reflections appear to be quarter res of output. So it looked like they were 1080p internally, and any of the metallic edges especially will show the internal resolution of the ray tracing. And that is a thing that's common to a lot of upscaling techniques. You'll definitely see it in FSR. You can definitely see it quite often also in DLSS, less so on the edges, but more on the internal detail with DLSS. And that is an area where DLSS's ray reconstruction comes in. And now that is something that Sony has not talked about at all. They're currently using PSSR just to upscale the final color output of the game, most likely. And DLSS ray reconstruction takes the noisy input and then upscales that as well too with all the ray tracing. That is something that I would actually be curious to see if Sony invests in time, maybe for the next generation of PS6, but definitely. But I would be curious to see if we see evolutions of PSSR over time, because right now in this title, it, due to the lower resolution rendering of RT, it's much more easy to see that internal resolution. And I feel like that's like not so great looking, but the one thing that did look really great with the RT reflections was how it's nothing like Forza Motorsports. They are high quality, They seem to reflect a lot of the surroundings. A lot of the cars are in them with a good look to the car in the reflection. You can see like a lot of that in the footage here, as well as when they show the internal shots of the cars from those replay footage. You can see like rougher plastics and rubbers are also getting reflection, something that is not at all in Forza Motorsport. They just look good, bar the resolution thing I was talking about. Yeah. So I think this is interesting, is that it's showing us a game that is noticeably lower resolution in the PS5 Pro performance mode with RT.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I would say that GT7 was not actually the very cleanest game in the world, even though it was at 4K in its PlayStation 5 incarnation. And here I did notice that in areas of the image that were relatively stable between frames, it was being reconstructed to something that, to my eyes, compared to GT7, looked pretty similar. So it did give a pretty similar to 4K resolve. I don't know if they're going all the way to 4K here, but it looked quite similar. It could very well be the case that they are with PSSR. I did notice some aliasing in the RT and some breakup in the RT, like when you're on that snowy track and you're right behind that pickup truck, when you're looking at the reflective detail on that, even though it's a very glossy surface and really should be giving you a clean and very sharp reflection, it's actually breaking up a little bit more than you'd usually think, and certainly more than you would have seen in the replay mode in GT7 on PlayStation 5. But like Alex mentioned, some of the rougher materials seem to be getting that RT reflection treatment, like in the center dash in some of the replay footage. It appears to be reflecting the driver's red outfit there. And there is some breakup in that reflection in the replay dash that makes me think, yeah, for sure that's RT reflections, because that's super indicative of an RT reflections technique. But I think, like, ultimately there's no free lunch here, and the PS5 Pro is very powerful hardware, but it does seem like when you're adding RT, especially potentially to a game that's at 60 FPS where you're also trying to do PSSR, you might not get there without a big res cut, because PSSR can get you there in terms of clarity, but it is expensive. So here I think you are getting a definite big improvement over the existing PS5 code. I think you might be taking a slight compromise to image quality here, but I think that ultimately having those RT reflections in gameplay is such a big boost to the quality of the visuals. And like Alex said, it's something that we don't see in a certain other racing title that did make certain promises about RT reflections during gameplay. So here, I think it's a very interesting game. It's probably the most interesting upgrade of the titles that we've seen thus far on PlayStation 5 Pro. And it's an interesting upgrade, maybe a slightly controversial one for those reasons, but I think ultimately probably a fairly satisfactory one.
Well, what can I say? I just want to test that 8K mode just for my own perverse curiosity, to be honest. Simply because obviously it's not going to be happening natively. I think I mentioned this in the Direct we did the other day. It's going to be leaning heavily on PSSR, and basically, how does it hold up? I mean, you were talking about 32 million pixels upwards for a single frame there.
Wow.
What is the based internal resolution there? How well does PSSR cope with that level of upscaling factor? Used to be the case that, I mean, when we first saw this sort of 8K push, it was with the 3090 on NVIDIA. They tried to market 8K. Didn't work particularly well, but and the irony is that the 4090 is actually a lot better at it, and you could probably do a pretty good presentation with it. But hardware class, we're talking like a downclocked 4070 here, producing an 8K output. That's a big ask. I've got to check that out.
Yeah. Also, the cost of PSSR is going to skyrocket. That's something that happens with DLSS. So it's going to be taking like a huge chunk of the frame time away. So I'm curious to see like, what's the balance there? Are they going to try like an ultra performance mode equivalent? You know what I mean? I don't know.
It's going to be like 1440p or below for sure, right? Doing it at 4K seems kind of crazy even.
Mm-hmm.
It does seem like a lot, actually, to ask.
So assuming 1440p, that would be like a 3x3 upscale, which we have to wait and see.
At 8K, it could be pretty good, I think.
It could be all right.
It could be okay if you're far away.
If you're far away. How far away?
That was my review back then when I did the 8K video about the 3090. I said like, ultra performance mode is better than I thought it could be, but you have to
Yeah,
be pretty far away.
the interesting thing with the 4090, of course, is that you can actually use 4K as the base resolution in a lot of titles.
Right.
And, you know, a 2x2 upscale with a quality upscaler like DLSS actually looks really, really good. So maybe they were just a generation too early with the 8K marketing, but by the time the 4090 came out, nobody cares about 8K anymore. Even though there's actually pretty cost-effective screens out there now. Anyway, let's move on. A couple of final games we want to take a look at here because they're certainly interesting. Dragon's Dogma 2 and Assassin's Creed Shadows. Again, very short presentations on both of them. But Oliver, you really wanted to talk about this brace of titles.
Well, I think we have about 10 seconds of footage here, maybe possibly total. And I honestly do not have a ton to say, but I wanted to mention a couple of things I noticed because I think they're interesting here. In Dragon's Dogma, I couldn't really see the difference based on the footage that we do have, which I think is literally like 3 seconds of footage. Again, it's very unfortunate that we don't have some deeper dives into some of these games.
What are you talking about? It's 360 frames.
Yeah.
That's
Actually,
what
no,
am I
it's
complaining about?
in 30 FPS mode.
It'd be 180
yeah, it's 30, yeah.
frames with 3 seconds. But yeah, anyways. So it does look like the game is running at 60 FPS instead of the unstable like 30 to 40-ish that the PS5 manages at maximum settings. It's possible the settings differ a bit here and it's using different settings, like not involving the RTGI. Unfortunately, the clip is such that I couldn't really tell, and it has that annoying black crush issue as well. So I have to like try to normalize the gamma, and then all of a sudden it's like, well, now I'm really in uncharted territory in terms of trying to evaluate the versus of PlayStation 5 output. But one thing I did notice is that it might be using PSSR now, because on camera cuts, I'm not seeing the same ugly checkerboarding artifacts and like the flying beast in the feathers of that flying beast. I'm not actually seeing the kind of stippled checkerboard artifacts. We're actually seeing like missing pieces that the sky is shining through. I'm not seeing that. So maybe it is PSSR. Again, it's a very brief showing. For AC Shadows, I think this is interesting. We've also seen recently some footage from the game that may stem from PlayStation 5 that showed some interesting image quality characteristics. But here, on areas of very fast motion in the scene, I was pulling out 864p for the resolution. It is running at 60 FPS here. Again, like a lot of the other games here, I think that probably does say something about the PlayStation 5 likely native resolution there as well. We don't know, but it could very well be. It looks pretty good here, I'd say, but there is a lot of fast motion in these shots, and some of the post-processing is not looking too great, like the depth of field not looking so great, exhibiting some flickering, some aliasing in the backdrop of one shot, and then the motion blur looks kind of almost undersampled a little bit to me. It does not look quite right. So yeah, just a couple notes. Again, we've not seen a whole lot of AC Shadows footage from consoles. Maybe we've seen some more footage from PC possibly, because their earlier showing was at native 4K, I counted it out as, so probably likely PC there. But just a couple notes on some games that have a little bit more interesting, potentially PSSR and PlayStation 5 Pro implementations. Okay,
cool. Let's move on again. I decided to take a look at how the PlayStation 5's GPU upgrade is likely to deploy in its game boost mode. Essentially, what we can surmise from this is that the 45% extra of GPU power will actually be used in backwards compatibility for games that don't provide a PlayStation 5 Pro official upgrade, so to speak. The only game that really interested me to any degree that I could actually do something on in a short period of time was Elden Ring. Okay, so head-to-head performance time, RX 6800s, pretty much 45% faster than baseline PlayStation 5 performance. It's got 60 compute units like the Pro, similar sort of clock speeds, I suspect. And we're going to be using the quality mode on PlayStation 5 here, which I think it locks settings, and it definitely locks resolution to 3840 by 2160, 4K, right? Now, the frame rate mode on PlayStation 5 has much the same settings, but it does have dynamic resolution scaling, and it can also seemingly scale quality settings as well, according to load. So quality mode is going to make for a much better, closer comparison to the RX 6800, because Well, we don't have DRS or settings adjustment happening dynamically on PC. Closest PC quality equivalent settings, that's the label on the right there. And the reason that's there is that some of the settings on PlayStation 5 are like hybrids of medium or high. So in that scenario, we've gone with the higher setting. Yeah, so with that, I've got to say, what I can't do is remove the stutter from the PC version. You can see it in the cutscene here. And there might be various other stutters throughout the clips here because I think it's still got shader compilation issues so far on from launch, which is pretty shocking. Elden Ring PC, still not a great port. Anyway, now generally in a lot of the clips I'm finding that the 6800's like 30 to 35% faster than the PlayStation 5, but that's typically because of VSync. We're capped effectively to 60 frames per second. It's a hard limit. Running it unlocked, if it were possible, would actually show more of a differential. Now, there are some rare cases where the 6800 is actually faster than the kind of 45% uplift that we expect. There's any number of reasons for that, of course, but I've got to stress here that I'm benchmarking an RX 6800. It's not the PlayStation 5 Pro, right? And without access to the actual PlayStation 5 Pro hardware, we can only project performance based on general ballpark specs. So it's just a bit of fun, right? Even then, even with a potentially higher differential, the 6800 doesn't lock to 60 frames per second. So in the confrontation with the Dragon here, for example, with a bunch of fire and water effects in play, frame rates are dropping into the 50s. It's not seen on the capture here, but I've seen it go lower, into the 40s even. Now, the PlayStation 5 itself can actually go down into the high 30s. So when we actually get hands-on with PS5 Pro, we'll be able to use this quality mode with its locked resolution and locked settings to get an idea of the real performance increase up against the base standard PlayStation 5, right? Would it be locked 60 in quality mode? It would be great if it does, but perhaps not. The frame rate mode, though, that's still going to be there. You're still going to be able to access it on PlayStation 5 Pro. And just the introduction of dynamic resolution scaling there should make a difference. It should get you to 60. So assuming Game Boost does actually deploy the full power of the PS5 Pro's bigger GPU, hopefully there'll be some good news there. Elden Ring might actually run locked at 60 frames per second for the first time on a console, God be praised. But this does all kind of assume that we won't be CPU limited, of course. I had to use my test PC here with the RX 6800, not the Frankenstein's PC with the Series X CPU, because that had real issues. But I think that's mostly down to the quality of the PC port, which is still lacking. Yeah, so I'm going to have to put together a list of games where we should expect to see some improvement even without patches, which we can put through their paces on PlayStation 5 Pro. Because I think ultimately this machine is aimed at people that have already got a PlayStation 5 who want more. I think that's pretty much a given. I don't think it's aimed at new owners as such. But I think this could be a nice little bonus in addition to the patches we're going to be getting. They're saying we're going to get like 40 or 50 games at launch for the Pro, which is pretty amazing. But, there are going to be outliers and there are going to be games that just get left behind. And I'm curious to see whether things improve there. Games with FSR2 with dynamic resolution, they should improve significantly, one would hope. Because essentially the more pixels FSR2 has, the better the output, almost exponentially so as you add more pixels. That should be good. But yeah, this was just an interesting little test. Entirely unconclusive at this point, I'd say. But, what can I say? I think it's going to be an interesting feature. And with that, I'm done. Anything to add to that? No. Let's just move on. Okay, something which we really do want to talk about is the pricing of PlayStation 5 Pro. Now, my sort of view on it at this point is that the price is the price. We're not going to be able to change it. The question is whether you think it's valuable to you, whether there's value there for you in terms of whether you want to buy it or not. What we can do as commentators is tell you what you're going to be getting for the money. And then it's down to you to make the valued call, so to speak. However, the price has certainly raised concerns and caused controversies. And there's been a lot of discussions about how we're now moving steadily into the kind of escalated price points that are typically held by PC hardware. And everybody on the internet seems to be coming up with their own PC part picker list, which will apparently deliver pro-like performance at relatively similar price points. And it's kind of came to a head the other day when I did a video with Destin on IGN. And he was asking me this question directly, and I said, well, you've got to start with a GPU that has the features of the PlayStation 5 Pro. And the closest equivalent at the moment, I would say, is the RTX 4070. What I should say is that the 4070, I believe, has more raw GPU performance than the PS5 Pro. I do think it's over 45% faster than the base PlayStation 5. So we're talking about a downclocked 4070. And then you've got to scale all of the extra costs on top of that. But yeah, I'm just curious, Alex, you're Mr. PC. What do you make of this whole debate? I'm kind of a bit wary about getting dragged into it because it is aimed at PlayStation 5 owners, right? With presumably PlayStation 5 games. You could have a PC that costs $20,000 and it's not going to be running any of those PS4, PS5 games. So it's, until like Shad PS4 and Chad PS5 comes along.
That's the locking in that they get you with, right? Mm-hmm. So you've already been software locked your entire backwards compatibility catalog, including disks, which is another part of something that we have to talk about. I think a very valuable part of the discussion of should you get a PC, can you get a PC for a similar price, is just looking at where you are on the globe. This thing costs very different depending upon where you are, as well as the cost of the things that allow you to keep your backwards compatibility catalog is different. So if you do want the disk drive because you've got a lot of PS4 games or even PS5 games on disk, well then this thing becomes more expensive. I don't ever think, though, the entire point of the console existence usually is subsidized hardware that they give you, and then they lock you in with the software and you pay a lot more over time, but you're giving them more through that software. This is a little different because I think they're making a good profit on it right off the bat based upon the number of the cost here. I don't think it is selling at cost with that price, especially in the EU.
I would say, just to sort of interject there, the Sony is a Japanese company and the yen is very, very weak at the moment. So if you can imagine a Japanese company sourcing components from all over the world with a impact to their buying power of their currency, they've kind of got to claw back the cost somehow. So yeah, I don't think that they're probably not subsidizing it, because the point of subsidizing is to bring more people into the ecosystem, right? But that's not going to be happening here.
Yeah, this is more niche. This is for the people who already own a PS5, etc. So I think that is a really important part, that is just going to be more expensive, and this is not as subsidized as like the PS4 or PS5 were at their launch in terms of like the price they're giving you, especially that base PS5 model that had a disk drive. I'm looking at it right here. So you got that, but I don't think even then, the economies of scale here, I don't think you're going to be getting, in terms of GPU power at least, something similar to that PlayStation 5 Pro at a similar price. I don't think that's just the way it works. You're a single individual customer not buying things in bulk. Why would you get a better deal at the exact moment of release? You really wouldn't. But the whole point of this entire exercise, which is why I think people are talking about it at all, is because the price is so high that it's like a new realm almost of like, what could you then instead consider at that moment when you're putting this much money down? And I think for me, as someone who plays PC games, I would say, depending upon what you want to do with the PlayStation 5 Pro, maybe you don't need to buy a PlayStation 5 Pro. If you want to get 60 FPS in every game, don't get a PS5 Pro. I don't think that's what it's supposed to do. That's where you'd start looking towards a PC, because the weakness in the PS5 Pro is still the CPU. I think the GPU is really fine for great looking visuals in most games, especially with PSSR, as we just saw. But if you want things like path tracing, or you want like 60 FPS no matter what, or 120 FPS no matter what, that is not what a console is. And that's when you start looking towards PC. And then honestly, stuff like an RTX 4070 is actually like a good notch higher than the PS5 Pro, in my humble opinion, just because I feel like, yeah, like Rich just said, like it's going to be better than that 45% that Mark Cerny quoted. But it's also like, if you do turn on ray tracing, then it gets a lot better. I think we saw that in Alan Wake 2 when I compared the difference between an RTX 3080, which was better in rasterized, but the RTX 4070 had like 50% higher frame rate with path tracing stuff on. It was like nuts.
Yeah.
It was way better. So yeah, these are not one-to-one comparisons. They can't ever be at the moment for price, but I think it's just like the price of the PS5 Pro makes it where you can start considering different things that are yes, more expensive. A PC will be more expensive than a PS5 Pro.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that just stands to reason, really. And, in terms of the 4070 comparison, yes. I mean, we haven't even started to talk about DLSS 3 frame generation. It's proliferating now on so many titles. Ray reconstruction. I mean, there's a lot going on. I mean, all of the technological innovation starts on PC, really. I mean, you do get these kind of once in a generation enhancements and innovations that consoles do provide. And if you look at what PlayStation 5 does, the stuff that it's doing with file decompression and the integration of the SSD is like scarily impressive, and still hasn't really been done on PC. So, there are different sort of tiers of technological innovation. But certainly in the PC space, NVIDIA are just in a class of their own in terms of delivering new features. 50 series coming next year, we're going to see more. The question is how many of those features will kind of be backported to prior GPUs. But even so, already we're seeing much more from the PC space. It is the place to be if you're interested in, the cutting edge experiences. It is the place to be if you actually want a competitive market for your games. That's kind of like one of the primary limitations of the consoles is you're forced into their ecosystem. You've got to buy games from their store. Whereas, PC, there's competition driving down prices. It's pretty great to see. Two different things entirely. Oliver, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I kind of would approach it from a bit of a different angle, which is to say that if you do want a PS5 Pro, if you're in the market for a PlayStation 5 Pro, you probably don't want the PC, or at least to the extent you do want a PC, you want them for different experiences. If you want a living room experience, then I don't think the PC at the moment is a very good choice. And I think you'd probably be fine taking a bit of a hit on performance to get a more reliable and usable gaming experience in the home setting. But the PS5 Pro just comes in and makes that substantially less of a compromise than it has been for the last few years. But like for me personally, I've been gaming on consoles primarily for a very long time. I will for sure be getting one because I play a lot of PS5 games. And I have a very expensive PC, but I'll for sure play PS5 Pro more in all likelihood. So I don't think the market is quite the same. But I do think that, a comparable PC with new components, it's probably going to be hundreds of dollars more at least. This is still a good deal, I think, if you evaluate it on the terms of like, this is a gaming device that you're going to be playing a lot of, then I think it's a good value. It's just not as good of a value as like a PlayStation 5 was at launch. And yeah, this is priced for people who have a little bit more of a willingness to spend money on a gaming console, and they're less price sensitive. And I think that ultimately what Sony's trying to do is they're trying to find the peak of where they can price these consoles, because certainly if you look back at what Apple was doing a number of years ago, back then an iPhone cost like $200 subsidized. Now they cost like $2,000 unsubsidized. And it just so happened that everyone in the cell phone market just thought that the most you could sell a cell phone for before people got sticker shock and fainted was like $300. But then they found out, no, we can actually sell these things for much higher prices, because guess what? People use their phones all day. So for people to use their consoles for 10 hours or 20 hours a week, maybe that willingness to pay is actually a little bit higher than the market previously thought people would bear. That's kind of the theory of the case. And I think for a lot of people,
that's an interesting idea.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, there's kind of like a lot of factors to consider here, and we can only really cover some of them. I mean, um, ultimately, though, PC is the place to be if you want raw performance, and you pay for that performance. It's interesting to note that, I mean, I've just been following this with much interest on X/Twitter. People are kind of like coming up with their parts lists, and there are deals to be had in the PC space. Typically, when new AMD GPUs come out, the prior generation ones are available sometimes at scarily low prices. You have situations like Intel Arc GPUs, available for under $200, which is kind of just the nature of the PC market, but it doesn't really reflect, stuff like the cost of a pre-built, for example, which is probably what most people would consider rather than building their own PC. There's so many factors to it. There's sort of bargain chasing, which drives the price down, but isn't really reflective of MSRPs. There's the pre-built factor where sometimes you can actually get a good deal.
Yes,
and I've seen, for example, recently I saw a 12400F PC for sale in the UK with a 4060 for £500, which is kind of PS5 money. VRAM limitations aside, that machine will do anything a PlayStation 5 can do and more, and it's the same price. But these are kind of like, these are the exceptions, not the norm. So if you are going to be making that jump into the PC space, it's you've really got to shop around. It's not that you can go to Amazon and get a machine that's delivering that kind of value. It's a different beast entirely. But I think we are seeing on a general level prices of consoles increasing simply because stuff like inflation, stuff like chip manufacturing costs. And I do think the weak exchange rate for the yen is causing issues with Sony, which may explain, that 120,000 yen price for the PlayStation 5 Pro. So yeah, it's a kind of nuanced discussion, but I think it's probably something people might be considering more for next gen, which we'll talk about in a minute. Okay, well, that's all of our discussion points. We're going to move on to supporter Q&A now, which is the part of the show where every week we ask our audience for questions, and we choose the ones that are best, or rather the ones we're best equipped to answer. And yes, I'm going to actually stick with the whole pricing discussion at the moment because we've got three questions here that are broadly similar. We'll start with the one from the infamous Alan from the Discord. Hi team, with the announcement of the 5 Pro, Sony has fired the starting pistol on 10th gen. Seeing the 5 Pro specs, what do you think where do you think the PS6 will be? I'm thinking PS6 announced Q4 2026 to be released in 2027! Exclamation point.
Wow.
That's pretty close. CPU, GPU, Zen 4 and AMD RDNA 3 custom SoC. I think it's going to be RDNA 4 at minimum. Because that's what PS5 Pro is. RAM 32 gigs of GDDR6 SSD. PS5's weird 825 gigabyte. I think that'll be at least a gig.
32 gigs seems like a lot.
Yeah, I mean, it's they're spitballing. Dedicated AI machine learning SSD slot, digital only, no controller. Uses existing DualSense. That's not going to happen. 600 to 650 pounds. I think this is let's do the next question. Pseudo natural. Hello, custodians of the digital! Exclamation point. Before the announcement of PS5 Pro, I was ready to trade in my still fresh PS5 Amateur Slim and get a pisser machine.
Yeah, get that pisser machine.
Yeah, after that dreadful 9-minute train wreck of a presentation, I decided to save up for a PS6 instead. But I wonder, is Sony testing the waters for increasing PS6 MSRP? Do you think that 10th gen consoles could easily break $600 and €700? Thanks for your wonderful work! Exclamation point. Not so much a question, more of an observation. From Leftist Hominid. Did you ever hear the tragedy of Mark Cerny the Wise? I thought not. It's not a story the PC gamers tell you. It's a Sony legend. Mark Cerny was lead architect of the PS5. So powerful and so wise, he could design bespoke hardware to improve console image scaling. He had such a knowledge of the gaming hardware that he could even prevent gamers from having to choose between resolution and performance. The PS5 Pro's bespoke hardware is a pathway to many abilities some consider to be unnatural. Mark Cerny's PS5 Pro became so powerful, the only thing Cerny was afraid of was making a console too expensive, which eventually, of course, he did.
He did.
This is only going to make sense to people who've seen Revenge of the Sith. Everybody else is going to be sitting there wondering what on earth is going on there. But I think this is kind of like it's a pricing thing. And, let's consider, first of all, Alan's point. We've got now a marker laid down in the ground for the kind of machine that Sony could deliver in 2024. And it's expensive. And historically, we've never seen consoles sort of reduce in price. Well, I guess we've got PS3 as an outlier there. Is this a marker that's being laid down in the ground that's saying, well, if you're going to want your console next gen, it's going to be quite a lot pricier? And what do you think of that, Oliver?
I think that I would expect more than one PS6 is my guess. Because I think that you cannot hit a mainstream price point anymore with a true generational leap. You can do a generational leap or a reasonable price, but not both. So like I see this spec sheet and I think, there could be a room for a console like this. But I mean, I don't know. It just seems tough to me. Like when you're talking about a console that could cost $700, $800. In Canada, it's 960 Canadian dollars, almost $1,000, almost quadruple digits even for the price. I think that that's not a price that the market is going to be willing to bear for most people. I think they're going to want to have an entry-level console. I think maybe Microsoft was a little bit ahead of the curve with the series designs. And I think that probably you could have a console like this and that people would be interested in it. But you also need a console to sell to someone who is just wanting to play those games, wanting to get a good experience, but it isn't necessarily wanting to get the latest and greatest graphics technologies and the most advanced visuals at the highest frame rates. They just want something that they can play the games on.
Interesting. So Series S was just a generation ahead of its time then.
Possibly.
You're suggesting exactly the same concept, which I find to be intriguing. Alex, thoughts? Wow. I mean, looking at Alan's potential spec sheet here, it's basically going to be the case that there's a lot of things here that are just, well, what can I say, that we're possibly projecting too early, because I think there's a good few years left before we do have the new hardware. We don't really know what that new hardware will be based on the AMD parts bin that's going to be available at that point. But I think, from my perspective, the games industry can't continue to ramp up on technology, because it is going to reach the point where we're pricing out the mainstream audience that consoles are designed for in the first place, right?
Right. And that's why I actually do think the PS5 Pro is indicative of PS6 pricing to a certain degree, because they experienced with what Microsoft warned us about the whole, making a mid-gen refresh machine is going to make it more expensive and not be able to tier our price down, essentially. That ended up happening really intensely. That's why the sticker shock is there. And I don't want to comment so much on these specs here, but I do think Oliver's idea of maybe the two tiers is interesting. Maybe not a separate PS6 like junior, maybe not. I don't know. Maybe it's just that there is some fluid generation there where the PS5 is like much cheaper by that point to manufacture. Maybe. That they just keep cross-gen forever. Like the next PS6 games are all just also going to target PS5 or something like that. Something along those lines where they just keep up both,
so
both generations at the same time.
The phone model, really.
Yeah, because I'm pretty sure like you can get old iPhones from manufacturer. Can you still get the old iPhone from Apple? Yeah. Like the non-latest version? Yeah, well, maybe it's just like that then, I guess. Or, like with Intel, Rich, you were just talking about a 12400F. They're still selling those things, even though they are not the latest generation and the latest, part of the stack of the generation as well, too. That's already been replaced technically. But you still get 12400Fs out there. it's cool. I like that actually. But it shows that the rate of progress is different as well, because that would not, like if you did that in the 90s, that thing would suck, you know. So it's very different. I think really it's gonna be more expensive, and there's gonna be some sort of fluid generation there in terms of what's the base model.
Interesting. What's my take on this? Yeah, I think the games industry needs to have a bit of a think about where it's heading, because, you know, ultimately more performance now means more cost. So do we need more performance, or do we need to be thinking about what it is that we want from gaming that can be achieved with similar performance to what we have today, but maybe with more innovative features? Machine learning is going to open up a lot of opportunities. So it kind of makes sense to double down on that. And I guess that's kind of what's happening with PSSR in the Pro. The thing that kind of slightly underwhelms me is that, you know, they've put a lot of investment into a machine learning block, and they've essentially produced an upscaler, which is kind of like essential, I think, at this point. But I was expecting to see more. You know, if you go back to the Sony demos of yore, you know, it was all about experimentation, you know, testing new things. Machine learning can do much more than upscaling. Obviously, we've seen frame generation added by NVIDIA. There's going to be new stuff coming from NVIDIA, I'm sure, for next generation Blackwell cards. And, you know, I'd like to have seen Sony have their own take on what machine learning can do, because I think that's probably part of the key to actually making an affordable machine. The question is whether people really want more power. I mean, Nintendo Switch has been incredibly successful this generation, and that's certainly not anything to do with power, you know. If we think about the success of the Wii, I mean, it's not my favorite machine, but, you know, it was essentially, dare I say it, an overclocked GameCube. You know, that it was just it was a gaming concept driven machine. So I think there's a lot of chin stroking and head scratching about what the next generation 10th gen is actually going to be. We know what Microsoft thinks it's going to be. It's going to be a handheld that's also somehow scalable to the biggest generational leap of all time. And I've got to see what that is. But, you know, what we're seeing here is proof positive that the biggest generational leap of all time must surely come with a pretty hefty price point. So, you know, what's going to happen there? I just don't know. Let's move on to the next question. This one comes from a lucky bagpipe. Hello, dearest gents. Do you see any chance that Sony would provide PSSR in some form or other as a software update to the regular PS5, or will this remain solely with the PS5 Pro? Thanks for your great work! ! So I had a bit of a think about this one, Alex, because, you know, we've got an example here of in the real world XESS, yeah, which has got the DP4A path. Unfortunately, DP4A is not supported on the base PlayStation 5, so that particular avenue is closed off, possibly.
So I would just say no, because Sony, apparently they said custom, you know, machine learning, etc. when they in this presentation for Mark Cerny. They invested little millions of hardware dollars to make that possible. Then if it can be backported to PlayStation 5 in some capacity, seems to me like it diminishes the image of their Pro console, diminishes its advantages.
Yeah.
And I just don't think it's technically possible either. So otherwise, you know, yeah. No, one thing that I'm very curious about is if there's some backwash to AMD with this, because AMD is just like, I have no idea, man. They are just, Sony's leading their innovation, which to me is kind of, it just seems a little bit sad, because, you know, like it used to be in the past that AMD would try and push their innovations through their desktop GPUs and releases there. But now, starting with the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X, they got RDNA 2 feature set aspects before the PC did. On PC, they released this like half-baked RDNA 1 thing that is not scaling as well these days in a lot of ways. left you out kind of without these features that are defining the next generation of video game graphics. And I'm wondering, does PSSR, does that research and block and everything that they've done there for the PS5 GPU spill into future versions of RDNA? I would hope at least PSSR does, because they desperately need something. They can't just be riding the FSR2 is open source train forever, because the audience backlash is already there. And I don't know, but that has nothing to do with PlayStation 5 Pro almost. Sorry.
I also think it's tricky because the PS5, we don't know. I don't know that we know to what extent the PS5 can really accelerate int 4 or int 8. I do know that the Xbox Series X, they did say 49 tops of int 8, and I think 97 or 98 tops of int 4. You can do int 16 on PS5, but that's pretty slow. So I don't know. Like, obviously, I think that they're quoting 300 tops. I don't know if that's int 4 or int 8 on PS5. Probably int 8.
I think it's int 8 with sparsity, according to what I read online.
That would make sense.
But so that's more
way,
like Ampere.
Way more than even the Series X. And I don't know that I honestly don't know that we know or can know exactly what the hardware in the PS5 is capable of, because they did not talk about it at all. That would place some pretty severe limitations on just the performance level that you could apply to this kind of math. So I think it's very questionable.
The only way I can see this working is if it's not a machine learning based solution. It's just like, Sony's technology group have decided, well, FSR2 isn't working too great. Maybe we can come up with something better. And it would be, maybe not PSSR, but it would be, PFSR. That's potentially a route forward for them. Maybe like a family of upscalers, one for the base unit, one for the Pro console. But the Pro console fundamentally has the hardware to do it. The base one doesn't. We're talking about the Radeon graphics cards there, Alex. It is still ironic, and it is ironic that there is a machine learning based upscaling solution for AMD GPUs, but Intel makes it.
Yeah.
And obviously, you don't quite get the same quality, but in theory, you could just give it more pixels and take a bit of a performance hit and get the quality.
Right.
So that is kind of baffling, that one. But it's just the way it is. It doesn't seem to be a priority for AMD. And here's the weird thing, right? I mean, we've got RDNA 4 coming, and we know that RDNA 4 RT features are seemingly baked into PlayStation 5 Pro. But why doesn't RDNA 4 have, well, we don't know yet, but we've seen no evidence that it has a kind of machine learning integration to the same level as what NVIDIA's doing. And I was thinking to myself that, it's now 4 years on since DLSS 2, and that's more than enough time for some kind of hardware equivalents to have been built into the architecture of new AMD GPUs. So I've got to see what they've got coming up. Surely they they can't lag behind to that particular, to that extent. It just doesn't really make sense. And obviously, they are heavily invested in machine learning elsewhere, because they've got a big investment happening in data center. So I think this is kind of like, dare I say it, the genius of NVIDIA, the foresight that they had in 2018 to actually converge data center and gaming into one hardware design. And obviously, it's taken time for that to actually gain traction, but it was a long-term bet, and the long-term bet has paid off. But we're kind of on a massive tangent on that particular question.
Sorry about that's my fault. I was like, just so for some reason so annoyed.
Anyway. Yeah. Okay, next question. Dudley the Gentleman says, or rather asks, with the inclusion of ML/Tensor hardware in PlayStation 5 Pro, why do you think Sony hasn't invested in a machine learning based frame generation technology like DLSS FG? Do you think? Well, my take on this is that obviously, Sony would be aware of the potential of what their machine learning block can do, but you've got to remember that it takes minimum 4 years to make a console, and so they wouldn't have really been aware of frame generation as a concept when they first started, architecting the silicon. Alex, thoughts?
Yeah, so the machine learning part is just one part of what makes DLSS FG possible. The
Yes.
reason why it's not an Ampere has to do with the what is the
Optical flow
motion flow
accelerator, I think.
encoder?
Yeah.
Optical flow accelerator being like 1/4 or 1/2 the speed in Ampere, which would make it untenable from either at least NVIDIA's perspective, quality and or performance. They would either have to reduce the quality of the optical flow to like quarter res, which is something I think you see actually in FSR3, or yeah. So they would need to maybe use that kind of hardware to make the frame time worth it, and that would be more hardware. I mean, there is a like a the ability to record videos from your PlayStation 5 on the PlayStation 5 with a dedicated hardware block, right?
Yeah.
But it's probably not up to the quality that would be used for something like DLSS 3 FG. So I think it's not just, I think they could research it, and this is probably an amazing like first step for them, because they're going to get all of those ICE people and Sony first party studios that are going to maybe want to do something special with this, and it's going to flow back into their design. One thing that I didn't talk about, like today we talked about how PSSR was pretty easy to count and had issues in some areas that DLSS just doesn't have, but they have the advantage of designing their games around its existence. So they could avoid areas where it has trouble. You know what I mean? That's what they do with checkerboard rendering in games. They try not throw a lot of things on screen that checkerboarding sucks at, right? So, there is greater quality to be had even without changing PSSR's algorithm. It's just a matter of designing the games around PSSR from the get-go, and these are all just patches at the moment. So yeah, there's that. But I think Sony's going to use the PS5 Pro's existence to kickstart all their ML research for whatever PS6 has.
Yeah. And if actually, going back to Turing on NVIDIA, you needed to make the hardware to actually kick off the revolution. If you haven't got a good degree of hardware out there with users, nobody's going to touch the technology. So it's a necessary step. So I think it is just basically a case of patience, really. Do you have anything to say about this one, Oliver?
Not too much, but I would say that, there is a technology for this that possibly, definitely could run on PS5 Pro, which is FSR3. And who knows, maybe that could be integrated with PSSR. And then all of a sudden you have a very potent upscaling and frame generation technology combination there. So that could very much be a possibility. And I think FSR3 is pretty good. So
yeah,
I don't think
it's
there's
perfectly viable for consoles, for sure. Yeah.
The need is not as urgent as the image upscaling need that Sony seems to have addressed with PSSR. It's not quite as urgent there for the console, I would say.
Absolutely. Okay, let's move on. We've got another couple of questions here that I'm going to combine into one discussion point. First of all, Karen O'Neill asks, with the $699 price of the PS5 Pro, do you think NVIDIA and AMD are seeing this as a chance to attract new customers? How do you think this price point could impact next year's CPU and GPU price points? With Xbox dwindling as competition, it feels like Sony is now more directly competing with the likes of NVIDIA and AMD, and it could result in PC gaming being a better place for price per performance. Retro Sean asks this question. Dear DF, thanks for the coverage. Unlike most, I don't think the price point is too high. Is it that everyone has forgotten how expensive GPUs are? For a PC, the equivalent graphics card would cost about as much as the whole Pro system. Well, it's not quite that much, but I get the point. No. Should gamers put their expectations in check? Well, I think, in the wake of the PS5 Pro announcement, NVIDIA were probably quite happy about the pricing. I mean, they've been relentlessly battered for the 40 series pricing for a couple of years now. So, it's kind of like highlighting a trend that, performance is increasing, but you're going to have to pay for it. Oliver, do you think that this is actually going to cause this kind of competition, a more sort of direct level of competition between consoles and PCs? Because I'm struggling to see it, to be honest.
I'm struggling. I think that if you go back 10 years and you were to say, hey, here's a $600 console, here's a $700 console, I think you would spur people to go to PC because it's comparatively possibly quite a bit cheaper there. Even for a decently capable computer, possibly it could be competitive. But at the moment, hardware is just expensive. Everyone's fighting each other over price all the time. There's just no making this hardware much cheaper, at least at the moment, not without some revolution in process technology or something. The processes keep getting more expensive. Cost per transistor not going down, like Rich always says. And things just get more and more expensive over time. So I don't know what you do about that. I think that you have to make gaming as a sector viable, and you have to make it attractive to people above non-gaming alternatives. That's, I think, the state of the problem at the moment. I think that everyone's feeling pinched by that. I think the cost of consoles goes up, but then you compare the cost of the PlayStation 5 to comparable PC hardware, and you're still getting a deal. So I don't know. It seems to me like I think it's still reasonable. I just think the state of the market is perhaps not reasonable.
Mm-hmm. Alex?
I don't think there's a direct competition because, if anything, all these PS5 games are coming out on PC. Like the multi-platform future, Microsoft's games are all coming out on PC too, obviously. So it's I don't think it's that. I think, like once again, earlier Oliver said it, there's just like two different beasts of people here regarding what you want to do when you play games. Some people just really want to sit on a couch and not think about much. And the PC at its current incarnation is less that. So I think it will push some consumers there. There'll be a competition for some consumers among them. But I don't think it's going to be so direct at all. It's just going to be happenstance when it does start happening for some people. Also, this is an optional upgrade. It is not the only PS5 you can get, right? So, like, if you really care that much, maybe this is your problem, but this is totally optional. You can still buy a PS5 or an Xbox Series S, so...
Well, and even that, lower-end PS5, even with the price hikes, it's still, like... You look at it compared to PC hardware, and it's still doing okay because, like, the cost of mid-range-ish or lower-end PC hardware is not getting that much better. So it's kind of, again, assuming you do see this competition and this choice for users between the two platforms, and I would maintain there is, like Alex said, a difference between the kind of person who's interested in a console and interested in a PC for gaming. I still think you're ending up with a situation where the PC is increasing, the consoles are increasing, and it all kind of washes out to some degree.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's just a lot of work that needs to be done for the user in selecting and choosing a PC. They don't know that a 4060 is broadly equivalent to a PlayStation 5 GPU. Nobody's telling them that, well, apart from us. But you know what I mean? In terms of general marketing, it's like a PC is one thing and a console is another thing. But what we are seeing is that the price of the two things is kind of starting to converge. Now, you have to do a lot of acrobatics to actually get that PC pricing to deliver that same kind of value. And, not many people are going to be doing that. It would require a massive push from somebody like, Dell or HP or Lenovo to actually position a console up against a PC. There have been some initiatives in the past, though, where they've tried that. Do you remember the old tiny little Alienware console?
Yes.
The Alienware
based on
Alpha.
N51
or something?
The X51 was another one. The Alienware Alpha was a tiny little integrated machine which used laptop parts to create a kind of console-like machine. The X51 is actually more sort of an attempt to make a standard PC design into like a console-like form factor. Kind of had the GPU in the lower bay at the bottom there, and then an ITX
with the
board
riser.
And then a mini
cool.
ITX board that kind of sat in the main component. I thought that was really cool and a potential way that you could do it. And I think they even tried to have some kind of software built in that would make the whole thing work easier on a TV. I think what is quite interesting, I mean, this would require collective will from the PC side of the business, right? It would require the likes of Dell, Lenovo, and Acer and whatnot to be able to produce these console-like machines. But it's also going to require something that I think is coming, which is Windows actually becoming a decent gaming operating system with a nice shell for console-like people to enjoy. So I think it's an interesting discussion point, but it's not just about the price. It's about the nature of the product and the ease of access, so to speak. Okay, let's move on. This question comes from Skyrim Super Championship Turbo Edition 2. Again, he's missed out the hyper fighting. Anyway, I think Alpha. Skyrim Super Championship Turbo Edition 2 Alpha hyper fighting. There we go. I think PS5 Pro will perform better in practice than the presentation suggested. Sony could hardly show off games that currently look bad on PS5. I nonetheless can't see it selling well, even with a price cut. Will low PS5 Pro sales kill Sony's appetite for midlife Pro updates? And will it also kill developer interest in spending time on PS5 Pro features?
Interesting.
Yeah, this is a kind of interesting question here, which I think Eurogamer produced an article with a similar idea, which is to say that the reaction to the PS5 Pro so far hasn't been particularly great, but if it is a failure, will it kill off the concept of a Pro console upgrade happening in future? What do you think about that one, Oliver?
Well, I mean, it'll depend. I mean, this person says low PS5 Pro sales. We don't know whether the PS5 Pro will sell low sales. We also don't know what Sony's internal metrics would be for low sales. If they sold... Yep. I think it was something like 20% of PlayStation 4 consoles were PlayStation 4 Pro consoles subsequent to that console's introduction, something like that. Yeah. So if they have a bar, I would suggest that if it comes close to that number, given the fact there's a huge price premium over the PlayStation 5 for the PlayStation 5 Pro, whereas the PlayStation 4 Pro slotted in at the original PS4 price, which is pretty remarkable if you think about it in retrospect. Yeah. Then I think that will be a sales success and Sony will be happy with it. But yeah, I mean, I think in terms of the developer interest, I think doing PS5 Pro integrations should be not that hard because PSSR likely uses similar inputs to FSR2 and other common upsampling solutions. And the ask is not that enormous for a PS5 Pro mode. For the performance modes, it's basically keep settings the same, largely the same, including resolution, maybe keep it roughly the same, maybe bump up a few settings, but then add PSR to 4K, and you're in pretty good shape. So yeah, I mean, I think it should be pretty okay, and I think the reality is that we're facing a console universe here where we're going to see much more incremental upgrades, so I think this is just the way things go. Unless the PS5 Pro is a huge failure, in which case Sony's going to have to rethink a number of things, I suspect, for their PlayStation 6 plans.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Alex, do you think it could kill off the idea of a Pro console in future?
Maybe, yeah. I mean, PSVR 2 killed off Sony's VR dreams, probably, right? So did Vita, for the longest part, killed off their mobile dreams. So yeah, that is possible. One thing will also kill developer interest in spending time for PS5 Pro features. Now, this one I actually have a more nuanced opinion about because I always look back about Xbox One X, and there was a couple of Xbox One X upgrades from developers where I just thought like they completely missed the boat. Like it would still have like Xbox One quality settings,
right? Yeah,
but at higher res, which is like to me like what are you doing? Like really, like as soon as you have to make something. Like you have to code against it in a dedicated way where it is a bespoke platform that they need to target, well, then it means more time investment. And if it is such a low margins thing for them, it may not get as much attention as it possibly deserves. So I imagine there's going to be a lot of PS5 Pro upgrades that we think are kind of not so great. Like just they don't go as far as they should. And in the PC space, I would always complain about those things. For example, like if a game just like leaves something at like console like settings, even though it doesn't need to, I will complain about it in a PC video. That kind of thing can happen with the PlayStation 5 Pro. And I think that's a weakness as well with the console model of it needing to be dedicated machine that is coded against in a specific way versus here are a bunch of settings and you make the game look better yourself through those settings. So I think that's like a weakness that maybe over time, when Sony gets to their PS6 generation, it'll be different because they'll have maybe continuing ecosystem of PS5, PS5 Pro, and PS6 all at the same time, and they'll be lasting for the similar amount of time. Like maybe PS5 is actually like a 15-year machine. Who even knows? But at that point in time, I think just having to make developers spend extra amount of time for a specific version of the game is unreasonable versus that fronting that cost to the consumer in terms of they pick modes and they pick graphics themselves. I know Oliver doesn't like that, but I think that's just maybe the trajectory a little bit here, because I do think it is actually annoying for a developer to have to specifically support a better platform. Or even
I don't know, Alex. I mean, if we're positing that Alan Wake 2 on PlayStation 5 Pro has a 30 FPS RT feature, they wouldn't have coded that feature from scratch. It would have been backported from PC, right? So
potentially.
So yeah,
potentially. I mean, there's a different API there.
Yeah, that's a fair point. But I do think that ultimately games are designed to be scalable, and they are designed to do great things on higher end hardware. So there are the features, they're not coming up typically with these features from scratch. They are there. They just need to be adapted.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
I'm always so skeptical about it because I see just how not well handled PC versions are.
Yeah, fair point.
And, so I always feel like when Xbox Series X gets like the shaft, for some reason, I'm always like, yeah, I know what that's like.
The concept of this killing pro consoles, I mean, it's definitely a possibility, as you like to say. I mean, it's a possibility. As to whether it's actually going to happen, it all comes down to the expectation levels Sony has for the hardware. The difference between the Pro and the PSVR 2 is that it's going to be supported. Sony has mandated that there has to be support for every game. Going to have 50 games at launch, seemingly. Between 40 to 50 is the tally, apparently. So that's just going to continue in the same way that it did with PlayStation 4 Pro. However, with PlayStation 4 Pro, there were some quote unquote lazy sort of upgrades. How many games did we see on PS4 Pro that were just basically the base version running at 1440p, for example? It's really key that that innovations like PSSR are actually used. But ultimately, I think most developers are going to be using FSR2, so hopefully the drop in for PSSR would be relatively straightforward. You would think that Epic already have a plugin integration for PSSR for Unreal Engine 5.
I hope so.
You'd think, right? So, I'd say the chances are better than PSVR, but the price is going to be a test for the market. Let's move on. Final question here from Cookie McCrumble. What game reveals would have made the PS5 Pro reveal an insta-buy for you? If they'd announced Bloodborne Pro or something like Resistance Trilogy Remake, I'd likely have dribbled all over my keyboard while trying to place my order. Be interested to know what games would have had a similar effect on you wonderful specimens. Well, this is an interesting thing. I think what Cookie McCrumble here is trying to do is suggest that there could have been an elevated level of interest by actually having a great game reveal in concert with the hardware reveal, which typically didn't happen with PS5, for example. But maybe bearing in mind the challenges facing this one, having some kind of software reveal would have helped. Oliver, any thoughts on this one?
Well, if we're talking about games from last generation consoles, last generation consoles possibly, I'd think like there are a lot of great PS3 titles that I love to see, like the Nathan Drake collection that's on PS4, but it could be 4K 120 on PS5 Pro, MotorStorm collection, Ratchet and Clank, God of War, lots of older franchises that either aren't on more modern platforms or are on more modern platforms in a somewhat compromised form. In terms of new titles, I'd love to see what Naughty Dog is cooking up. I'd love to see I don't know, just wish casting a new Persona game on Unreal Engine 5 with top-of-line visuals. I mean, if I'm just throwing things out there that won't happen. But, you know, I mean, there are lots of games out there that I'd love to see for PlayStation 5 Pro. I trust they'll be revealed in the fullness of time, possibly later this year. And I would hope that those titles are shown off in such a way that doesn't just homogenize the consoles into one kind of PlayStation platform, but actually does show off some of those differences so we can get a bit of a flavor for how the console's being exploited in games that are presumably being designed to some large degree around this new hardware.
Alex?
I feel like they could have trotted out something that was not possible before. I don't think they're going to do something like Cyberpunk path tracing. I just don't think the performance is probably there based upon what we've seen so far. But I feel like they could have been a bit more like the Hogwarts one was really just like, I know it's a really popular game, but like it did nothing for me in terms of like visuals. Like they showed it at 30 FPS. Like they could have replaced that with something, maybe if they said like we theorize like, oh, Alan Wake 2 could be having RT reflections, and those are like really good ones, you know, like or you know, there's been other titles that have released on PC since the PS5's release where the PC version had more transformative ray tracing. You have things like Dying Light 2, which does run on RDNA 3 cards reasonably, and it should run even more reasonably on RDNA 4. What about Dying Light 2 with a ray tracing suite at 30 FPS, showing that off versus they're just like the reluctance to show it off next to the PS5 version of the game looking actually not too great, I feel like is part of that. But I feel like they really should have chosen the eggs that they put in that basket a lot better for that initial reveal. And I really do think it was way too short. They should have spent way more time on the upgrades because it was so streamlined and fast. Like those Ratchet and Clank differences that they showed off, the Spider-Man ones, I think they're like on a screen for a total, if I look at my timeline, like 2 seconds.
Right.
Like I'm looping those 2-second clips here. Like I feel like our videos try and labor the differences better.
Yeah.
And
yeah. Well, this is a tricky one, isn't it? Because you could have added star appeal to this presentation by having a great new, fantastic new game, and you'd have shown it running on PS5 Pro looking fantastic. But then obviously the question would have been, well, it's got to come out on base PlayStation 5 as well. So when are we going to see that? And, you know, you certainly can't differentiate too much between PS5 and PS5 Pro because the majority of the users are on the base PS5. So it's certainly a tricky one. And maybe they just don't have a game yet that is, you know, first party in nature that does actually put the upgrades through their paces and, you know, produces a measurably different experience. There's an easy way you can do this, you know, to sort of set Pro apart from the base PlayStation 5, which is to be, you know, to have like a Pro specific mode, you know, that's you'd have the PlayStation 5 modes as well. You'd have a Pro-specific mode, which specifically targets the features of the Pro and the strengths of the Pro. But I think based on Sony's first-party timeline, they probably don't have a game yet that actually can do that. And the third parties would have had even less time with the hardware, you know, unless, you know, they camped out at CD Projekt Red and said, okay, you know, let's do something special with Cyberpunk. That clearly didn't happen. And there is already something really special with Cyberpunk, but it's happening with NVIDIA. I think they're caught between a rock and a hard place, really. And maybe there will be game reveals. There's still the second part of the prophecy, which is that, first of all, there would be a reveal, and then there would be a state of play. And we've still got the 30th PlayStation anniversary celebrations to kick in. Maybe it's just part of the timeline, part of the pipeline, before we sort of see more. That would kind of make sense, right? Okay, well, that was the last question, therefore the end of the show. So please do like, subscribe, share if you enjoyed the content, ring bells for things that may or may not appear on your devices, which will lead you to more Digital Foundry content. Store.digitalfoundry.net for all of our merchandising wares. And please do consider our supporter program. The original PlayStation 5 reveal obviously wasn't particularly well presented on YouTube. We've got an 86 megabits per second download available on df.net, which actually is transformative and is the basis actually for what we did for this video. So yes, there's that. But that's all from us this week. Thanks for watching and supporting Digital Foundry, and we'll see you next week.